Hey everyone, happy February and welcome to another PDN Live. I'm your moderator, Shannon. And tonight, as usual, we have Rob Pincus, and our guest tonight is William April. And our topic tonight is preparing intuitive responses in emergencies. This will be a really interesting topic tonight. And we are encouraging all questions to come in for this. So if you are listening live and you hear something that you want us to expand more on, just let us know. We're more than happy to answer those questions. Of course, the more on topic your question is, the more likely it will be answered. So with that, let's get started. Rob, how's it going? Haven't seen you in a while. If you want to give us an update on where you've been, what you've been up to. We got the PDN tour coming up. We've got SHOT Show that happened. So if you want to give us an update on that.
A lot going on. So yeah, SHOT Show happened. That was one of the busiest SHOT shows I've had in a long time. I did a lot of presentations there. We had Caleb Causey also joined me for a presentation, one of our PDN contributors. And I think a lot of that was streamed. Portions of those things were streamed live through PDN. And then they're all available now all over the internet. So if you want to see some of those, I did a lot of things with Rob Latham, continuing our Worlds Collide series. And we've launched the Worlds Collide Facebook page to support a place for all those videos and some of that banter between he and I to live. And yeah, the tour is getting ready to start. So it's just been a busy couple of weeks, getting ready to head over to Europe for European SHOT Show, the EWA show, another annual event over there. And then right after that, I'll be down at the Eastern headquarters, the home range in Florida, kicking off the 2018 Personal Defense Network training tour. We're probably going to have about 120 classes total. A bunch of them are already posted to the calendar, the training tab at personaldefensenetwork.com. Once we're done with this live broadcast, you go check that out and see if class is posted somewhere that you're interested in going or someplace that you already live. That's the beauty of the tour. The other dozen instructors and I will be coming out to a place near you if you live in the United States. Honestly, there's going to be so many locations this year. It's hard to imagine that we're not going to hit almost every state and certainly every region of the country, which is cool. We've got what else going on? I'm here at USCCA headquarters this week. Of course, there's a lot of collaboration been going on between Personal Defense Network, ICE Training Company, and USCCA, getting ready to launch the Live Fire Instructor Development Program. So I'm doing some work here this week. Then I head to PDN headquarters Thursday and Friday, and back to the Western headquarters for about a week before, again, that Europe trip comes up. So incredibly busy. It's not a busy time of year as far as end user training classes go, not spending a lot of time on the range, but definitely a lot of prep work for upcoming distance education and the tour itself.
Did you see anything interesting at SHOT Show? Our viewers always want to know, what did you see?
You know, probably the, I don't know, I tell you what, the new line of 511 clothing, I've kind of like shied away from the 511 brand years ago because it just kind of got overplayed and over tactical, a long way from their roots as Royal Robbins company. And they're kind of making their way back. There's some great clothes that are much more casual wear, much more blend in kind of stuff. So I thought that was kind of neat talking to them. Hollow Sun is in. A lot of people know that I spent a lot of time with their gear last year, kind of experimenting with it. Honestly, it was about this time last year I ordered one of their red dot sights and mounts. 2 sets of mounts came with it for like $200 off Amazon. I was really impressed. Started talking to them last spring, started evaluating some more of their gear, and they're in as a 2018 Personal Defense Network Training Tour sponsor now. So they've got a lot of cool stuff I'll be talking about a lot over the next couple months and using on the ranges, demonstrating. You'll see that in the hands of myself and a lot of the other PDN tour instructors. I don't want to go too deep into all of the tour sponsors, returning sponsors, and new ones. We'll be making those announcements over the next couple of weeks. In fact, I'll be taping some of that tour promo stuff on Friday at PDN headquarters. And what else did I see? You know, the fire control unit, the X1 that takes the fire control unit from the SIG P320, takes that trigger group and drops into that kind of cool personal defense weapon type thing with a collapsible stock. People saw me do some video work on that late last year. I got my hands on one that is actually mine now. That happened at SHOT Show. So they started getting a little bit more publicity and more traction. They're starting to ship those items as a retail item now. So those are kind of cool. And I think not just that, which is it's a lot of fun to shoot. And I'm sure it'll fill some useful roles as far as defense or personal defense self-defense weapon, or maybe even some armed security or motorcycle law enforcement officer roles as an actual useful tool. But I also think that the fire control unit is going to usher in sort of an era of much more customized guns, and maybe even like one-off level customization of guns at a reasonable price, with things like the high-end 3D printing that gets done now, that will accept the trigger group from the 320 and some of the other firearms that are now having the serialized part, the actual firearm, be nothing more than really the trigger control group. So that whole trigger group comes out of the frame of the pistol, and then you put it into kind of whatever you want, which is really neat. So I think the fire control unit is the first of many cool innovations to come for not only the 320, but other firearms that are going to be designed and built the same way in the future. So I think that's kind of neat.
Very interesting. And then, of course, inquiring minds want to know, what's the weirdest thing that you saw at SHOT Show on the show floor? Good
clarification. It had to be that ridiculous Franklin Armory reformation, the shady, sketchy, gray area, kind of legal, but oddly just not talked about. So there's no law against it. Incredibly inaccurate and silly thing. That was overhyped and then definitely underdelivered, and has been mocked brilliantly since SHOT Show, because silly.
Funny. Awesome. Well, all right. So we'll get back to the serious stuff now. Thank you for the update on that. Oh, and if people want to find you and find your courses and where you're doing, where you're going, where can they find you, Rob?
Find me. If they're watching PDN Live, they know where to find me under the training tab at personaldefensenetwork.com. So
awesome.
Before I don't know where you're going to go, but I do need to say that some people who follow PDN and follow my social media realize that up until maybe 24 to 72 hours ago, depending on what promotions you saw for this week's live event, it was going to be on another topic. We've pushed that topic off to the future. And the main reason we've done that is because William April, a PDN contributor, has done a couple DVDs with us, and he's certainly been featured in a lot of the content that I've put out over the last, 5, 6, 7 years, was suddenly available to come on and talk about this topic, which as a mental health professional, as a trainer himself, someone who emphasizes the importance of being able to respond efficiently and not hesitating in the moment of a dynamic critical incident, made himself available and said he'd be happy to come on and talk with us about that area that he's really passionate about, and that area of study that he's put a lot of time, effort, and energy into. And then, of course, we can't not mention the school shooting that happened in Florida. And the topics that we're going to talk about tonight really do relate to all areas of armed defense and unarmed defense, personal defense, safety, and security in some really big 100,000-foot view ways. So certainly they're applicable to the people that are thinking about active shooter response and talking about active shooter response. I'm not one for the thoughts and prayers thing. I'm one for, hey, this is when people are listening about this stuff. This is when people are looking for information. This is certainly when people are talking about what would I do, or what should I tell my kids to do. Go share the resources that Personal Defense Network and Endeavor Defense and Fitness and Ryan Hoover and Alice and Faster out of Ohio, and all these programs and all this training and all this information, it's out there on active shooter response. And now is the time to be posting that. If you want to honor those people who lost their lives, and as a tribute to them, you want to do something, help others stop spree killings faster in the future. Help reduce the number of victims the next time evil shows up by helping people prepare to face that. And that's a big part of what I think tonight is going to help people understand how to do. When people look at this kind of stuff and they say, how could I ever do anything except freeze in terror, right? Maybe not the PDN premium members and the gold members and people who've been through our classes, but the average person, your family members who aren't watching this tonight, that looks at something as tragic and crazy and scary as an active shooter spree killer event, and then thinks about their kids. How could they do anything except freeze and be scared and be terrified? Well, we're going to talk about that tonight with the help of William April.
Thanks for that, Rob. And William, I mean, Rob pretty much introduced you, but if you want to talk a little bit about yourself and why tonight's topic is of interest to you, and the research that you've done, and basically your credentials of why this is important to you.
Well, I have spent my professional life in mental health. This is my 20th year in mental health. And before that, I was in law enforcement, and I found myself working in the areas where those two things overlap. And they overlap quite a bit. And the ability to kind of speak both languages really meant I got to do some pretty interesting things. And as I got into training myself in the early 90s, I started running into what was to me surprising sort of linkage blindness between the two. Gun people talking about mental health was often pretty far off the rails. Mental health people talking about guns and gun violence, unquote, was even more off the rails. And so it's been an area where there is a lot of valid information out there, but it just isn't being used by and large. And so I think it's really important that people that have some interest in both really do their best to draw on both of those important pools of knowledge and bring them together. I mean, I don't think anybody disputes that the goal is to understand and to understand mass violence, especially school shootings like we're talking about, but more importantly, to use that understanding to prevent, minimize, mitigate that kind of violence. So I think it's an incredibly critical topic. Right now, it's on the forefront of everybody's mind, but we'd like to keep it there and not just have it be a strictly reactive mindset where after an event such as this happens, suddenly it's terribly important, but 90 days out, it's fallen off the front page and fallen off people's working memory. And I certainly hope that's not the case.
Well, very good. And for those of you, again, that are listening live, if you have any questions for William or Rob, just feel free to type them in. And again, the closer to on topic they are, the more likely they'll be answered. So with that, tonight's topic, we're going to talk about the best ways to prepare and make quick decisions and execute planned responses efficiently during emergencies. So, William, let's start at the very base and core of this. Let's talk about the bad people, the ones that create the chaos and mayhem. How do bad people think and act?
Well, one of the most important things to remember is that everyone's the hero in their own story. Even guys that you would think from the outside are clearly objectively bad don't walk around head in hands thinking, goodness, I'm the bad guy. I'm walking around and everyone is at risk from me. There's a wonderful book called Virtuous Violence that really gets at the inner workings, the sort of mental gymnastics required to make yourself the good guy when what you're planning is so far outside the realm of normal acceptable human behavior. But the other thing is to keep in mind is that there are reasons. Just because they don't make sense to the normal, ordinary, rational person, unquote, doesn't mean there are no reasons. And so thinking of the violence as unpredictable or magical or mystical or the product of mental illness is really a huge mistake. There are reasons. It's our job to delve into them and to see what they are, and not to weigh them using our standards, not to look at them with our eyes, but instead try and understand in context what was the meaning of the act.
And with that, so how bad people think and act. So they think that they're doing good. Are there any behavioral cues for the good guys or those that aren't out to be evil? Are there any cues that you can see just from people who think they're doing good, but even though they're not?
Well, you accidentally sort of stumbled onto something that bothers me quite a bit, is that people seem to want checklists about events like this. And the problem with checklists is no one fits them perfectly. And if you're sitting there with a 12-item checklist and the person exhibits behavior that isn't on the checklist but does directly precede a violent attack, what was the value of the checklist? What I often say is that we've got, as part of our evolutionary endowment, two really effective systems baked into our brains. Those are threat detection and behavior prediction. If you free people to be concerned about things that concern them and not worry so much about why the thing concerns them, then things change quite a bit. Because everyone has the experience of just having gotten that weird feeling from somebody and later on finding out that they did something terrible. And so encouraging people, liberating people's ability to detect threats from others and to predict behavior based on that perceived threat, that's the first step. What the person is about to do, to me, is irrelevant. If it feels bad and my senses are telling me that it's going to be bad, waiting around for a differential diagnosis doesn't make much sense. And it might cost us the time we need to survive.
So with that, what about the not bad people? You and I, what cues do the not so good people give off that let us, that give off? And then also, what cues do we give off that lets the bad person know that we're a good victim?
Well, the most dangerous one, I mean, in terms of predicting violence, of sort of drawing violence from a violent criminal actor, is what we call prior victim status. There's a pretty compelling body of research to show that violent street-level criminals are significantly better than chance at determining whether someone's been victimized before. Victimized in property crimes, violent crimes, all sorts of things. And prior victim status is a little bit like blood in the water for a shark. The problem is you can't erase your past. If you have a history of victimization, especially repeat victimization, if you live in a kind of a culture that has repeatedly victimized you, the notion that that will draw further victimization is really a terrible and self-fulfilling kind of prophecy. So what we want is our folks, especially students with prior victim status, to know that they give off something undetectable except to the very worst among us. And so that's something you've really got to account for if that's part of your background.
So let's explore that just a little bit further. If you have been victimized and you're giving off this vibe unbeknownst to you or the common person, but the person who preys on that, knowing that you've been victimized, what can you do? How can you train to not give off that vibe?
That's a tough question. And the state of the research is really about the fact that there is a there there. The more sociopathic offenders tend to be, the better they are at determining prior victim status as part of their target selection process. But what is it specifically? Well, the most telling feature is gait, how you walk. But it's such a subtle process. It's not that you can say prior victims always limp on the left and let's just take care of that. So it's very difficult to say, there's no shop you can go to have your walk corrected. It does express a whole lot of stuff about your physical construct, but also about your demeanor in the world. And so getting comfortable in your own skin again, that's a real challenge for victims of physical violence. And what we'd hate to think is that the fingerprint of that physical violence remains on them after the fact and actually makes them more likely to be re-victimized. One of the things that I found really works quite well, especially for women, is participation in fight sports. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, boxing, Western boxing, non-consensual physical activity, right? That forces to move against an opponent and to take contact from an opponent. To get comfortable with that again has a real effect, but telling victims of prior physical assault, hey, I need you to get comfortable rolling around with strange, sweaty men. That's a tough sell. It really is. So it has a good effect, but it's tough to get over. It's a tough hurdle to get over, and understandably so.
William, isn't a lot of this that we're talking about from both sides, from trusting our gut feelings to the way we're selected as potential victims, or the way potential victims are noticed by the predators, is non-cognitive decision making, and it's not something you're going to process. Oh, I saw that person limp with their left foot. It's just something you pick up on because of experiences, mass experiences, and data that's come in through your brain, and the experiences that lead up to recognition.
Absolutely, and I would, I think there's a pretty clear understanding that some of that is just genetic endowment. Any trait that's beneficial genetically will get passed on and concentrated. Predator traits and also prey traits. So it's certainly not a thought process. One of the things I've found interviewing violent criminal offenders is that they're what we call bad historians, which is a polite way of saying they don't tell their own stories very well. They can't really illuminate their own internal process very well at all. They just kind of rely on global statements like, I'm just doing what I do, or I'm just putting in work, or I'm just trying to get paid. So it really relies on a lot of factor analysis that's much more in depth to try and figure out what did they do that they can't explain that they were doing.
And that has worked against us as trainers and educators in our community for years, even trying to examine how the good guys win, how people survive violent conflicts. They don't know what they're doing either. A lot of this is intuitive. You said something to me when we were talking about doing this about the phrase you used was pre-need decision making. And that really stood out to me as a potential way for people to respond more efficiently and more really intuitively based on a training model, based on the things they actually do, not relying on genetics or relying on luck or having to do something radical necessarily to change the way they appear to the rest of the world, but putting something into place in their preparation for dealing with violent conflict or any kind of conflict that could escalate to violence. I'm really curious to hear your explanation of pre-need decision-making and how it can start to empower people.
Well, I don't mean to smile, but it is a stolen phrase. I had a patient who was a funeral director, and is talking about things about his job that he hated. One of the things he hated was walking clients through what he called pre-need decision-making. What he meant was buying plots and paying for headstones and paying for coffins before someone has died. And the phrase just really struck me. Pre-need decision-making. That's exactly what we need to be doing. So I just want to acknowledge I didn't make that up. I stole it flat out. But what I often say to people is, I don't want the first time that you face a particular challenge, a particular crisis, to be midnight at the corner of State and Main. You're not going to acquire new knowledge, skills, attributes, and tools on the fly. Far from it. But that doesn't mean we're in a chase to have canned answers to specific threats or specific problems. This is what I'll do if I'm attacked by a person 5'9" to 5'11". This is what I'll do if I'm attacked by a 6'4" person. Those kind of specific plans are useless and they don't survive the onset of the problem. But there's a funny thing in decision making. Just literally seconds of planning is associated with survival, with thriving in crisis. The kind of people who can plan on the fly tend to thrive under life-threatening stress. And so I like to talk about making a parking spot for a kind of problem. And a parking spot might be something as vague as this. If I'm at work and I hear gunshots, I'm going down that back staircase that nobody ever uses, and I'm running to my car as fast as I can. Now, that's not the world's greatest plan. It doesn't have any tactical elements, hardly any Velcro, but it would work. It would work very well, and it's robust. And just having thought about it for a minute or two, you'd be surprised how much retention there is of that at the moment. Your retention is going to be better than you think, and it's certainly going to be better than your on-the-fly planning.
Yeah, the improvisation might get you through, but having some, even like you said, base level plan really is where it starts. I talk about people who carry a gun. You know, you come to a stop sign and you're sitting in your car and you look around, and what if the carjacker came out from behind that corner? You know, when you pull up against a car and you realize I don't have any room to maneuver, next time I come to the red light or next time I pull up behind a car with a stop sign, I'm going to leave myself half a car length so I could floor it and turn to the left just to get away from the guy coming at my car. And what happens? The next time you run the stoplight, you don't pull right up on the bumper of that van. Now, it takes repetition, right, to make that a habit. But it starts with thinking about it and then taking the opportunity to execute that plan every chance you get, even at such a low level. So obviously, you're not going to have gunshots go off in the workplace. But once you develop that plan, it might make sense once a month not to take the elevator and actually go down the staircase and find out where the dark spots are, where the slippery spots are, where the entrances to other floors or other exits. Where does that exit even come out on your building? Do you know where the stairwell exits on the ground level at your building? A lot of people probably don't.
You know, a pretty good plan executed with urgency is going to beat no plan and improvisation. It just is every time. You know, when folks, you know, we're not talking about a tactical plan, unquote. We're talking about a conceptual plan. What are my goals in this kind of endeavor? What am I trying to do? What is the big picture goal state that I'm after? And you don't need a finely detailed plan to make that happen. So, you know, a little bit of planning goes a long way. And plans are remarkably elastic. If you get something in the ballpark, your plan will have some elements that will translate. So instead of worrying about specificity, I worry about effectiveness instead.
Yeah, I love that concept of conceptual planning that you talked about right there. That's a great phrase. You know, in counter ambush training, we talk about the need to be able to execute your skills and develop the ability to make decisions on the fly while processing information, to be able to shoot while you're assessing what the target's doing. To not assume that you're going to know there's a target in front of you and another threat to the left, and you're going to shoot, swing, shoot, but to realize after you're done with the first threat, all you can plan for is the need to break your focus on that person and start looking around to figure out what to do next. It's silly to try to think you're going to know what's going to happen. And you go into that IDPA stage mentality of shoot that guy once, shoot that guy once, shoot that guy once, and then see which one needs to get shot again, as opposed to just deal with what you've got and know that you're going to have to figure out the next step and plan to do that.
And you know, you can see, I mean, it's a very concrete example, but you can see the failure of that sort of thinking in drills and matches. Or let's say somebody has to, you know, put a single round on a target, service that target, transition to the next target. Well, they're so worried about the second target that they miss the first one. It happens all the time. They're so worried about getting the prediction right and getting all the value, the juice, so to speak, out of that prediction, that they're not taking in data. They're not interpreting it and using it in service of the big picture goal, of the conceptual goal. You know, my conceptual goal, if something bad happens in the workplace, is I don't want to be here. It's not a very technical goal or a very elevated sounding goal, but I don't want to be here is a great goal if a workplace shooting starts.
Evade, get away. The idea that we started tonight with you talking about violent criminal actors and sort of like how these people aren't rational in the way that we think, but they're rational in their own way. They have their vision. And that's probably one of the most important things that I ever heard you share. And it's what really first impressed me about you was your ability to articulate things about the criminal mindset and sort of debunk a bunch of myths and do away with this perceived need that I think we all start out with of trying to figure out why something is happening. You don't need to know why it's happening. It's happening. Something's about to happen. You don't even need to know what the attack is going to be. You've got that feeling. Give yourself permission to act. I know it's one of the things that you've talked a lot about. And one of the DVDs you did for us at PDN, that was a big piece of feedback that I got from people who really found value in that was this idea of not needing to know why the bad guy is being bad and accepting that the bad guy is being bad, whether it makes sense to you or not.
Yeah, you know, that one of the things that I sort of feel like I'm sort of tapping on people's foreheads all the time is when the fire department shows up, they don't pour off the truck and start shouting, "Where are the matches that started this fire?" Nobody cares, right? The problem is the fire. We'll have plenty of time in the aftermath to figure out causality. And that moment of, searching for meaning, more than anything else, is just dressed up denial. Dressed up denial that it's happening. And we've got this weird notion that if I don't understand it, it's not allowed to impact me. That that's just not fair. That's not how we say cricket. Well, it is happening. And it really doesn't matter whether you understand it or not. It is, I hate this expression, but it is what it is. These events have a facticity of their own. And the longer you wait to start appreciating that, the greater risk you run.
And there's then a translation into what you're talking about in terms of your conceptual plan, which is it really doesn't matter like what's at the ground level when you go through that doorway. It's not the guy that was shooting on the 8th floor, and that's good enough. And if you don't know, you don't know. If you can figure it out ahead of time, great. But otherwise, that place is better than this place. Don't second guess the escape as an option. Right.
You know, it doesn't help to perfect a plan if it meets a crude conceptual goal, right? You know, this is one of my major beefs about school shooting plans, internal plans that schools have. If your kid came home from school and said, "Mommy, Daddy, we just got a new fire escape plan. Now they want us to lock the door and stay in the room and wait for somebody to put the fire out," you wouldn't let your kid go back to that school. And you'd think the principal was insane. We want to take people as far as we can from the fire, which is why we have fire drills and why school children in America, by and large, don't die in fires. And yet, when a shooting comes along, which is nothing more than a self-contained, purposive fire, I hate to put it that way, it's every bit as lethal of a threat. We tell people, stay still and wait. Somebody will come and solve the problem. Well, every single one of those minutes is mortality.
And the problem is that we know that when the bad guy shows up before the good guys show up, kids die or get gravely injured unless they have managed to squirt out of that room. I think about Sandy Hook. There was one classroom where there were only 4 or 5 kids that didn't get seriously injured, and most of the kids in that classroom were killed. The 4 or 5 that survived, I forget exactly whether it was 4 or 5, they ran past the gunman as he came in and literally left campus. They went to a former teacher's house that was near the campus. And when I go into schools, their number one pushback to me on let the kids leave. You'll find them later. 99.9999% chance you'll find them later is, well, what if they run out in traffic? What if they get hurt jumping out of the 2nd-story window? What if they cut themselves on the glass if they break the window to get out of the room? And I'm shaking my head. I understand it like for like 2 seconds, but if they hear themselves say it and they process the reality of it versus the guy with the gun killing kids, I can't, that's still their concern, because the number one thing teachers do, first thing every day, first thing every year, take attendance. What happens when they do the fire drill? They take attendance. Do you have your buddy? All that stuff, alphabetical order. There's so much accountability for where are the kids that it's really institutionalized, and it gets in the way of the most basic, simple ideas. Don't be where the guy's killing kids.
Yeah, I think that kind of regimented response to everything in schools, it's crowd control, and I get it, and it makes sense. But this is such an abnormal circumstance that virtue is no longer helpful.
The exception.
You would think so, and so, the notion that we can just use the same responses for a different kind of threat is crazy. And when you say it out loud, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, teacher, principal, do you really think it's safer to stay in the room until the guy with a gun kicks in the door than it is to run across the parking lot and maybe fall down? It's when you say it out loud, it's such a model of isolated risk management. We don't want kids running around. That's bad. Nobody ever says, what are they running from? And maybe that's bad, but way better than the other alternative. And the other notion is fire drills. By and large, when you leave the building in a fire drill, you go to the parking lot. Well, the problem with that is the size of a bomb I could put in a vehicle in the parking lot, knowing that it's going to be a secondary collection point for people, is astonishing. When I bring a bomb into a building, a school, into a school, let's say, the biggest bomb I can carry is the biggest bomb I can carry. I can put 2,000-pound bomb in a car in the parking lot where I know you're going to bring all the kids to. So we've got to start really thinking this through, especially as ballistic and pyrotechnic combined attacks get more and more common. Think about Columbine. That was a ballistic and pyrotechnic combined attack, and was actually intended to end with a hijacking and an aerial assault on the U.S. Capitol. So the layered attacks are getting more and more common, but the thinking of so many people that are responsible for the children is staying static, and something's got to change.
Well, I think we're starting to see another evolution. I think we saw, one evolution, particularly in the law enforcement community after Columbine. Sandy Hook was a huge wake-up call to the civilian population and the school systems themselves, I believe. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing already this week is the realization that, hey, this guy did a few things because he knew what responses were in place. So as we, it's just that terrorism is an evolving crime, and the bad guys are always going to find a way to pick the new lock. Well, so are the spree killers. They're going to find another way to do things. But you go back, you look at it and say, okay, well, this isn't the first time that's happened. I mean, you mentioned the secondary collection point. The guy who bombed the abortion clinic, I believe, was in Alabama in the 80s, who then set a second bomb out near the dumpster where people normally run when there's a fire alarm or anything else. It was that place on the other side of the parking lot that he set that second weapon attack. The situation where in Virginia Tech, the guy came around and locked the doors, changed some of the doors, knowing that people were going to use certain exits. There was a guy with, I believe it was a workplace violence, or maybe it was a government assistance facility, where he pulled his truck up to block the back outward opening doors behind the building, and then came back around the front and started attacking people. That was 90s also. So there are these evidence points that tell us, hey, the bad guys aren't crazy dumb. They're just crazy evil. And they may be really, really smart about how they're planning these things out, which again, I think speaks to your point of conceptual planning, not I'm going to step with my left foot first, but I'm going to move.
Right. There's always an internal logic, even to a spree killer, that just about everybody would feel comfortable using the word crazy about. That doesn't mean they're devoid of internal logic, that the behavior is random. I mean, even James Holmes, the Colorado theater killer, clearly and floridly schizophrenic, and yet very high IQ and able to harness it in this perverse and obsessional way. And the stuff he did was very, very clever. A layered pyrotechnic attack with bombs to be set off by children, bombs to draw the police to his apartment, use of the back door of the theater, which has to be unlocked for fire code reasons. I mean, this isn't, I would say there's crazy and then there's crazy.
Right.
And that was crazy enough to work. So we've got to start really taking some fresh eyes to look at what does a school's package of responses need to be? And it may be several, and we may have to do drills for each and every one, just like we do drills for fire. Well, that's a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of effort and lots of risk, unquote, like risk managers hate it. There's no zero risk alternative here.
And one of the things I'm seeing more and more is schools being open to the idea that maybe classrooms on the second floor are going to have a different response plan than classrooms on the first floor, are going to have a different response plan than classrooms on the third floor. And yeah, the kids move floors during the day, but they've got to be a little bit more flexible in their response and not nearly as linear as they want to be. They want the checklist. They want one packaged answer. The world isn't that easy. Shannon, we've been over here chit-chatting back and forth. I don't know if you have any questions that have come in on the live, or if everyone's...
Yeah, actually we do. Great conversation going on. We do have quite a few questions, but one that came in that I thought was very interesting was you to review. You've often discussed on the show, avoid, barricade, run, counter, defend threats, using the examples of malls, public transportation, churches, nightclubs, etc. Can you review those principles briefly from your perspective of what to do when chaos does happen? And then with that, can we follow that up with, from William's perspective of, okay, now we have the reality that something bad could possibly happen. Where do we start to prepare ourselves? Like how?
So
it's a lot.
Standard response plan that we have for the spree killing events or any kind of, emergent event is evade, barricade, and then respond as appropriate. It's the run, hide, fight that's been put out by the government for the last several years. But I like the term respond as appropriate a little bit more. It's a little bit more open-ended, right? The fight sort of says, okay, this is what's going to happen next. Evade is very simply, don't be where the killing is happening. Don't be in a place where the bad guy can hurt you. Won't get away from that place, then barricading is the act of making it harder for the bad guy to get into a position to hurt you. That's locking the door, blocking the door, putting the doorstop in. Hiding is a form of barricading. The bad guy doesn't know where you are. It's harder for the bad guy to get into a position to hurt you. And then ultimately respond as appropriate. Obviously, people sort of mock the UK model, which is run, hide, tell, right? That you're supposed to call for help or signal or whatever that run, hide, tell is. Well, tell might be the appropriate response. If you were able to run and you're able to barricade, well, we talk about communicating in our home defense plans. Well, yeah, making sure the outside world knows where you are. The police know what you have to offer. The guy's outside the door shooting, and I'm in the bathroom on the third floor, and he's trying to get it into this room. That might help someone. So communication might be the appropriate response. In an armed home defense situation, you've got the door locked, you've got the gun in your hand. We tell people, don't scream out, I've got a gun, leave. Because now the bad guy might know where you are, right? Maybe he didn't know where you were. But the minute he's got the axe and he's trying to chop your door down, it's probably a good idea to communicate with him. I have a gun, I will shoot you if you come in. Maybe that'll get him to turn around and not force that confrontation. So respond as appropriate is the way we articulate that last step. And it's in a way, I think, along the lines of what William was talking about, which is be prepared to take information in and need to do something that may not be a complete script. Just know that getting away is the main thing. Delaying the bad guy's ability to hurt you is the next option. And ultimately, you may have to do something else. And certainly that something else includes fight if it's the last option. The follow-up question, I think, William, I would love to hear, where do you tell people to start, particularly people that might be hearing some of this information for the first time, people that are coming to you, not from the tactical gun world side, PDN world, but from the mental health side. Oh, you do that? How can I get started?
Well, I can tell you that a clinic, an outpatient clinic where I had an office once when I was working for a pretty large hospital system, that clinic had been taken over at gunpoint twice. Once by a patient in active addiction who was seeking drugs, took over with a gun, and once another patient, a patient killed another patient with a gun, and yet it was supposed to be a gun-free zone. And I would frequently get questions from other staff members, hey, are you going to be around on this day because a patient's coming that we're all concerned about? Well, that's just unbelievably sad, that the institutional response is going to be not to have a response, and that the people working there are supposed to cook up some ad hoc survival strategy, which is just, to me, insanity. The thing that, in my mind, is being not utilized on the school front, and really tragically, is that teachers love their students by and large, even the ones they hate, they love. And if you empower teachers to say, listen, I understand you have to follow the rules. I understand you don't want to get fired. I understand here are the policies. I get it. But when it comes down to it, do you want the kids to have the best chance at living? Then you've got to start thinking about, what are you going to do when the situation calls for something where the plan, where the policy doesn't seem to be helping? Well, you're telling people to break the rules. Well, maybe. Certainly not on behalf of Rob and Personal Defense Network. But you know, you may have to break a lot of rules in these kinds of abnormal circumstances. And if you're alive, and if the children are alive, to get in trouble after the fact, well, you know what? I'm okay with that. And I would bet you that most teachers would be too.
Yeah, I agree. We have a concept called should versus could. I don't know if you've heard me talk about it, but it really is the summary of that. And it's official, you know, Rob and PDN policy. Your plan certainly should be within the scope of the law or your regulations or school policy or whatever, but that the plan may not work. The plan may not be appropriate that day. And then what you should do is the right thing. The best thing in that moment may not be the thing according to the law of the land. I use the example of, okay, so in Paris, if I'm traveling overseas, I'm not allowed to possess a gun, control a gun, shoot a gun in downtown Paris. Got it. But if one of the armed police officers is taken out by a terrorist at the train station and his gun is standing there on the ground, just laying there on the ground, and I see the bad guy with his back to me 20 feet away in front of a brick wall, well, I have the skill and ability to know that what I should do is pick up that gun and put it into play to stop the terrorist. I've just broken federal law in Paris, but I'll deal with that afterwards. I did what I should do, even though it was against policy in the moment.
You know, there's even this concept called the doctrine of competing harms.
Absolutely.
Is breaking the school policy wrong? Yes, certainly it is. But under the kind of overwhelming and prejudicial circumstances of a school shooting, we've got to get our minds right. I mean, our priorities have to be, these are my kids and I need to do what it takes. Now, what I love about that is that some teacher who spends a while thinking, well, you know, I get that this is the school plan, but I don't know if that would work. So here's what I'm thinking about. Every single second spent planning in that way is going to translate into lives saved. Every single second spent thinking, well, how could I get him out of the building if I took that upon myself to do that as the best option? All of those seconds, not only are they wasted, they're priceless.
Yeah, and I think what you just hit on is really key too. You're sort of putting the responsibility back on them. Someone comes to me and says, "Well, what should I do?" Sometimes they just want me to give them an easy answer, and I don't know where you work. I don't know what the layout of the floor plan is. I don't know how many people are there. I don't know what the policy are. I don't know if you can carry a gun, if you have to have a scissors, a knife, a bat leaning in the corner that you're going to pick up as a blunt object because you tell people you play softball on Saturday. I don't know, but I bet if you think about it, you would come up with some really good ideas too, and be participating in the process, which gives ownership and is going to ease learning. It's going to ease recognition and recollection, and it's going to ease the efficiency with which you actually apply the plan because you helped come up with it.
Yeah, I mean, I personally know a teacher who has elected, I'm sure it's violation of his or her policy, to bring bought at personal expense a rather expensive mechanism for locking an outward opening door from the inside, and sufficient breaching tools to get out the very thick plate glass window. And I would give it up. His plan is when the shooting starts, he's taking his kids out. It's hard to fault somebody who's taken that much ownership of a real life problem.
Yeah, I wouldn't fault them. And what I tell teachers, okay, you can't, we talk about simple ways that the school system can set doors that are outward opening up for being secured. And I'm not saying secured forever, but secured enough to delay the bad guy from getting in and maybe have him turn to another door that isn't as secure. Well, it might involve, setting an eye screw into a cinder block wall to set up that quick draw where you're just going to clip on the carabiner or the chain links to close that door. Well, is that defacing property? Sure. But could you make it a coat hook? Can you make it something innocuous the whole rest of the time? And probably the rest of the time that building stands, it's not going to be used to lock the door from a spree killer. But there's plenty of ways around it. You don't have to do it telling the principal, oh, by the way, I put an improvised outward opening lock system into my classroom. You can probably get away with it. And if somebody gets mad, I was putting a coat hook up, but sorry, my bad. And I think giving people that information and sort of giving people permission to think outside the box and break the rules is the best we can do sometimes to empower people to make really good decisions. That's not to say, well, carry a gun illegally, you'll probably be fine. There's a line, and that line stops way before carrying the gun illegally, but it definitely goes past just wait for the government or the boss to tell you what to do.
These changes are often paradigmatic, and so of course they're pretty brutal. I mean, the received wisdom for decades when your plane is hijacked is be calm and wait for the FBI. Well, that ain't the way it works anymore.
Right.
And because of that shift, God's mercy on the next person who tries to take over a plane with a box cutter, because they're going to be torn limb from limb by people who now realize that the old strategy might not save their lives. And so I would think enough blood has been spilled in schools to have paid for these lessons. I've been contacted this week by a former student whose daughter was in the school in Florida. She was in a classroom, and the killer tried the door to her classroom, but it was locked, and he moved on. Now think about her, the daughter of the student, living with that. But picture if the door hadn't been locked, was incapable of being locked. Think how much worse that story would be.
Yeah, and I heard from a friend shortly after the event who had two daughters in a closet, literally texting him in a closet. And here's a guy who has training and has the guns, and he's 5-10 miles away from the school, getting the text from his daughters saying, "We're okay. We're hiding in the closet. The door's locked. Don't come here." Was part of that exchange. The idea that you might be tempted to do this, Dad, because you have the skills and have the gun, but I'm okay right now. I mean, the fact that we're having these conversations, to me, also indicates that these kids are starting to think it through, and they've been prepared. They've already had a plan of action, both from the school and from the home, and they're also starting to handle things in much better ways. I saw the one, of course, news story that everybody's seen, I think, with the Kevlar blankets that were used as a cover. They ended up not being shot at. I saw another clip today. Actually, someone contacted me from North Carolina, a news media outlet, wanting to link to a video we had put out through PDN about using books as cover. The books will stop bullets in many cases. And they also had a clip of one of the girls being interviewed who literally picked up a book, held it out in front of her, and that book had bullet fragments in it when the event was over. So we're starting to get this information out there, and kids are starting to hear it. And I think, honestly, my guess was is that if we looked right at the last week of Google searches on active shooter response, we'd see a heck of a lot of 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds are doing this research on their own. So it isn't just about the teachers and the parents. I think we also need to remember that these are young adults. These are kids making some pretty heavy, sophisticated social decisions. They're planning their lives. They're capable of making some of these decisions themselves, and not necessarily waiting for the decisions or the leadership of the teachers to get themselves out of that building or into a safer place.
Yeah, but also not just, one of the problems with responses is that policies are made by administrators, who are even more layers removed from the actual classroom. There may have to be substitute bottom-up leadership on these issues because the top-down leadership is driven by risk management more than anything. And risk managers aren't going to be there to take the bullet for you. And that sounds awfully cynical and kind of Charles Bronson, but it's real. And they're not going to be there to take that bullet for you.
And as you said, the teachers have a responsibility, and the teachers are invested in the kids. But how about the kids? Who's more invested than the kids being told, hey, survival may come down to your decisions and your actions. You may need to save yourself. You may need to save your friend.
I hate to sound so cynical, but it doesn't seem that blood is getting the paradigm changed from the administrative top-down viewpoint. I almost feel like it's going to have to be litigation. Wait until the round of lawsuits for failure to prepare for these problems. My child is dead because you did nothing. I don't think any administrator wants to be on the stand answering those questions.
No, and the problem is that works both ways. We after Sandy Hook, when we launched the school attacker response course, a lot of the pushback we got was from administrators who said, we don't want to get sued because we did something without the government saying it was okay or the school district saying it was okay. So that litigation thing works both ways. It's always going to be a cop-out, I think, from either side. It's going to be the cop-out of, well, we don't want to do anything because we might get sued, or the cop-out of, we're afraid, we did that and now we're going to get sued. It's just, it's very difficult to try to get anyone who's going to throw the litigation card to really respond, I think, in a meaningful way. And you're right, it's being on the receiving end of it that quite often gets change made. My fear is always that it's going to come down to a bureaucracy looking for cover from that insurance policy or from the school district, as opposed to an individual who's just willing to take accountability for, hey, I did the best thing I thought I could do, and now I will deal with the aftermath.
Yeah, it's saying, I don't know what the outcome will be legally or procedurally or whatever, but this is just not morally tolerable to stand here and do nothing. And teachers already have that kind of ownership. And so liberating them, I think, is the task of everyone else.
All right, Shannon, we got one last round of questions, maybe?
So we did, this one we will need to keep a little bit short. We are at the top of the hour. This might have to be a two-parter, I feel. But we talked a lot about schools and mostly unarmed situations. A lot of our viewers are armed. They do the classes. A lot of them, I know, have a lot of concerns about, having a defensive mindset at church in large group settings. How does that defensive mindset, or should it change?
I think you cut out just a little bit. I'm going to throw it to you, William, and I'm going to rephrase or try to recap. I think the question is, does your mindset or response change just because you're going to be in a group setting?
No, because still I fall back on, what is the largest scale goal? What is your conceptual goal? If my goal is to be safe, to keep myself and my loved ones safe, that doesn't matter if there's one person around me or 1,000 people around me. The goal is the same. What we don't want is people thinking that the gun is some sort of Swiss Army knife, that it just makes me safer just by virtue of sitting into my holster or sitting in my pocket. It doesn't. The gun should be a tool that's the product of a process of thinking that goes a lot further than the gun itself. I often say, when I get contacted about church security all the time, I often ask them, I get it, you want to talk about guns. Does your church have an AED? And they look at me like I'm crazy. And just for a second, they think I'm about to propose some defensive use of an AED, like waving the wires at someone to scare them away. But they're much more likely to have somebody drop dead of a heart attack than they are to have somebody walk in and start shooting. So what is the big picture goal? That has to be the start.
It really does. I think it's incredibly important. I want to make my kids safer. I want to make my school safer. I want to be able to help people in my church congregation. Those questions probably don't start or end really with a gun at all. And a lot of people who are into guns want to figure out how that's the answer. Obviously, a lot of people this week, we're seeing it again, another rush of instructors to say, I'll give free training to any teacher in my county, in my state, in my, within 100. That's great, but honestly, to me, it's a feel-good measure, just like the anti-gunner who says, I want all the AR-15s taken away, or the guy who cuts his AR-15 in half and says, this gun will never be used to kill kids, and throws it in the trash. It's a kind of an empty feel-good gesture. If the school district doesn't allow those teachers to be armed, if those teachers didn't go out and seek to take advantage of that opportunity in the first place, I don't know that offering free classes for teachers really helps. And we did a lot of free education with the school attacker response course, but it was aimed at the teachers and the school systems and the kids. It wasn't aimed at getting them to come to a gun range and learn how to shoot at a fundamental level that may or may not even be applicable in a spree killer crowd situation in that school hallway or cafeteria. So while I understand the intention and I respect the gesture, I think an organization like what Buckeye Firearms does with Faster program, where they come in and they do comprehensive programs, some of it school funded and some of it granted and some of it funded by people outside the school who support the instructors that go in and do medical training as well as all of the comprehensive security training. Plus, yes, there's an armed component. I would encourage people to try to help in that way. And if you're the local firearms instructor that doesn't have the medical skills and doesn't have the security assessment knowledge, be honest with those teachers that come to you and say, hey, yeah, I can fill this niche, but there's these other things that are probably incredibly important too.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's talk about follow-up for this topic. I know that there will be a lot of questions. There were a lot of really good questions that we weren't able to get around to tonight. So those listening live, you can still submit your questions. And then those who are tuning in after the show, please put your questions in the tab below. Rob will be on for the next week afterwards, checking for questions. And then William, for those who want to get in contact with you post-show, how can they do that?
Well, I have a website where I post trainings and things like that. April, APRILL, riskconsulting.com. And then on Instagram, I started recently doing little daily, hopefully productive nuggets, little nuggets to think about. And that's, again, the same thing, APRILL, April Risk Consulting. And
Great.
You can find me at those places.
I think that that series you were doing on Instagram, I was trying to figure out how long we've known each other. It's got to be 5 years, probably longer than that. But I really think that what you've been doing on Instagram is awesome. It's just real simple, quick tidbits of thought, motivating your wisdom, sharing books, sharing experiences, sharing news clips, and then some thoughts to motivate people to really see past how fast their split times are on a El Presidente or something in terms of thinking they're really preparing in a realistic way. And you've been teaching and traveling, I think, a lot more just in the last year than maybe historically. I'm seeing you all over the place. Where are some of the places you're going to be teaching in the next few months?
Well, I'll be in Columbus, Ohio this coming weekend. Then Little Rock, then, wow, all over. Trying to get more west this year, but probably about 35 to 45 dates this year.
That's awesome. Well, I'm really glad that you took some time to join us. It's been too long since you've been part of the Personal Defense Network contributor team. It's great to have you here. For those of you who aren't familiar with William's work from the past, he's got a couple of DVDs he's produced with us. There's a bunch of information that he's put out. He attends a lot of training conferences, and you also collaborate with a lot of people. You collaborate with a lot of great people from the gun side and the unarmed side. Wealth of information and a very different perspective than you usually get from the tactical personal defense trainer. William, I appreciate your wisdom and your ability to communicate things and give people insight into areas that we don't talk about probably nearly often enough. So thanks very much for joining us. As for me, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, personaldefensenetwork.com, click the training tab and take a look at the tour dates and locations list or ictraining.us. We're going to be putting out a lot of information over the next few weeks about our new tour sponsors, about the contributing instructors, about all the locations. We're going to reveal what the new tour truck is going to look like here coming up in March. And it's going to be a great year. 120 classes on the Personal Defense Network training tour this year, 12 other contributing instructors. And if you can't hang out with us, hang out with William April and some of the people he's collaborating with. In fact, you probably should think about doing both because the stuff that he's bringing to the table is really unique. Anything I forgot, Shannon?
The newsletter.
Oh.
If you like what you're hearing, we have the newsletter on personaldefensenetwork.com. Great content in your inbox. Great stuff like this and links to other trainings that Rob has done. Like he said, there's a lot of other topics on this or about this on the website. So check it out. More videos, more articles. Follow us on social media. And I think I got it all. I get it all?
All too.
I think I got it all. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, William. And Rob, thank you so much. And everyone who listened in, thank you. And we'll see you all next month.
Thanks a lot.